Okay, so now we're going to go over question 3, which is the arrays question. In this question, we reference to the following classes: the point class, which contains a public instance variable integer x and a public instance variable integer y. And then we have the line class, which has a public point instance variable called left endpoint. And then you have a public point instance variable called right endpoint. And then you have a public instance variable integer called slope. And then as you can see here, there's a constructor for the line object, and in which the first parameter is the first point parameter is passed as the left endpoint, and the second point parameter is passed as the right endpoint. And so our objective in this question is to figure out what all this lines prints out. And it's a lot of code. So let's use the Java visualizer to go through each and every step of this code. So here I've imported our point class here. Our line object is declared. And now we can start by running this main method. So let's look at this first line. In this line, we create an array with 2 spots to serve for 2 line objects, as you can see here in this step. Here we have created an array with 2 spots, and these are initialized to null because there's no default value for the line object. Then we create a point called p. And here we actually are able to initialize each x value and y value to 0 because the default value for an integer is 0. And then we do the same thing for q. And here we are. So right now we're at the point where we have an array of line objects with that, which at this time is null in both index 0 and index 1. Then we have point p, which has x and y value 0. And then you have point q, which has x and y value 0. So now we create our first line, which is going to be called pq. And pq, as you can see, takes in the parameters p and q in that order. So that means that our left endpoint is going to become p, as you can see here. The p points to this instance, which is our left endpoint. And then q is going to point to our right endpoint, as you can see here. So now we have this as our pq. In our next line, we have line index 0 is equal to pq. That means that we create a pointer that goes from line index 0 to pq, as you can see right here. And so now we do line index 0 dot left endpoint dot x is equal to 1. So if we navigate each arrow as such, line index 0, which is this object, and then dot left endpoint, which is this object p, dot x, which is currently 0, we now set this to 1. There we go. Then we have pq is equal to new line qp. And so that means we create a new instance of the line class where our left endpoint will point to q and our right endpoint will point to p because it was passed in that order. And then what will happen is that pq, instead of pointing from this instance where it was before, we now point to this instance. And now what we do is we have line index 1 point to pq, as you can see in this highlighted line. See, we now created a pointer that goes to pq. And so now we do the following. Line index 0 dot left endpoint dot y is equal to 2. So we do this. Line index 0, which points to this instance, dot left endpoint, which points to the point p, dot y, which is currently at 0, we now set this to 2. There we go. Then we have line 1 is equal to line index 1 is equal to line index 0. That means that line index 1 is going to point to the object that line index 0 is referencing. So that means that this arrow as you can see highlighted here as red, is going to point to this arrow, is going to point to this object, which is referenced by this arrow, as you can see highlighted in red. And so there we go. Then we have line index 0 will point to PQ. And so that means that instead of this arrow pointing to this instance, it will point to this instance. There we go. Then you have line index 0 dot left endpoint dot x is equal to 2. And so now we have this line index 0, which points to PQ at this point, as you can see here. And then we go to our left endpoint, which points to Q, as you can see by following the arrows, I believe. Yeah, here. And then dot x, which is currently at 0, we now set this to 2. There we go. Then you have line index 0 dot left endpoint y dot left endpoint dot y is equal to 1. And so that means we go from line 0 to left endpoint to y, which again is q. We set the y value, which is currently at 0, we set that to 1. And so now we finally get to the print statements. Here in this line, we do system.out.print line index 0.right endpoint.x. And in this case, as you can see here, it will be line index 0, which points to PQ, dot right endpoint, which points to P, dot X will point, which is 1. So we print 1, as you can see here with the space. Then you have line index 0 dot left endpoint, which will point to Q dot X, which is 2. We print that out along with the space, as you can see here. Then you have line index 0 dot right endpoint, which points to P dot Y is equal to 2. And so that means we print out 2 with the space. And then you have line index 0 dot left endpoint, which again points to, which now points to Q dot Y, which is 1. And so we print 1 with no space afterwards. And we are done executing this program. So now we are able to see that after all this code, our program will output this.